UMS Queen Mary is a frightened ship. And she carries with her a premonition.
No.
Of death.
Imagine taking a tour of the Queen Mary. Not as it is now, but as it was in 1938. And the stranger stories.
Ghost stories?
You want to call him the haunted tour?
Hi, Mom.
Dad! Hello? Hello?
Join our tour guides as they lead you into the depths to connect with spirits who still call the ship home.
Lucas!
If you stay here, you'll get trapped.
I can't leave my son alone here.
Stay with me. Forever.
David Ratch, travelling third class with his family. Piers, Mr. Ratch, lost his senses sometime after dinner. Captain, there's been a murder!
What did you do to my husband?
He's with the ship now.
Happy Halloween!
I need to leave the ship!
Although we're famous for our fiction, sometimes facts can be much stranger.
Thank you for having me. I kind of started off this crazy journey into becoming a producer, working in theme parks and starting off at the Disneyland Resort, where I worked on Phantasmic and driving floats. So you can't fault an 18-year-old going and saying, "Hey, would you like to drive a float, at a Disneyland parade or on water?" And they give you the keys. And I, since that point, I've been enamored with entertainment. So I started off there, started working a little bit with theme park design, and then moved over to producing. So we started working on the early versions of the Harry Potter theme park, actually going to be built in the UK. And then we, unfortunately, the people financing thought it wouldn't have the 10-year, 20-year term of being able to last through all these different Harry Potter movies, so they canceled it, and then Universal bought our designs. And then from there we went over to comedy, which was a completely change of a venue for us. And I wrote some comedy for Jay Leno for a year or so, into sitcoms with Andy Ackerman, who was the director for Seinfeld for many, many years. And then from there, I decided to get into the haunted house space because it just always fascinated me. And all those paranormal shows were getting very popular, where people were going out with Most Haunted and investigating various locations. So I said, I went to Santa Clara University, and right across the street was the Winchester Mystery House. So it just made sense to go and explore the Winchester House and whether or not anyone had made a movie about this location. And sure enough, no one had. And the owners of the house were actually Santa Clara University graduates. So I got the rights to that, and then moved from there to go to get the rights to the Queen Mary. And I always would look around Halloween, and Time Magazine would always put out most haunted locations in the United States or the world. And Queen Mary and Winchester were always in the top 5. So I had the opportunity to start walking through those locations, and I never had an experience, but I could see where people were very uncomfortable at times walking through the houses or the ship. and when it was down in the bowels of the ship or was, late at night at the Winchester house, you definitely hear some really interesting things. So that got me enamored with the world of horror. And then I started watching more movies, going back all the way to the 50s, and became just enamored with watching, movies in that particular genre. So that's where I've kind of ended up. Always. It was always fun to go through and experience that kind of. I got actually really fascinated with actually interviewing people as we were developing Winchester, with people who actually had experiences at the house or at the ship. And I think people, like one of our financiers who financed the actual Winchester movie, said that he went when he was, I think, like 10 or 11 years old, and he saw Sarah Winchester on a tour. A lady dressed in black, had a whole experience. He said, listen, my body went completely limp. Everything in the room was like freezing cold. And then I turned left and I saw he goes, it wasn't even a shadow figure. It was a woman in a black veil, at the end staring at me, and then scurried off, and he goes, ever since I had that experience, I've been wanting to make a movie about the Winchester Mystery House. And this is a guy that, has been an executive at some of the top tier studios in the world, not just one off the street telling you a story, So this is a guy who's very, very cynical in life, telling you I had an experience and this is real. So, and it's those kind of experiences that I had doing Halloween events at the Winchester Mystery House, where we would form Halloween events in the vein of like Not Scary Farm or Halloween Horror Nights or whatever. And we would have constant occurrences of actors who were put in the house having paranormal, I would say, sounds come their way, or even shadow figures, or even objects moving by themselves. And they would quit on us within a moment's notice of going, I had an experience, I'm not going back, and thank you very much for employing me, but I'm no longer working here. Yeah, it's quite a concept, going and doing a haunted house at a haunted location. It's almost like you're asking for it, At the Queen Mary, it's funny because in the past they've had paranormal tours go through and even investigators, and at times the homeless in Long Beach would sneak on the Queen Mary and would and hide in corners of the ship. And they, people would actually encounter these people, and they said, oh my God, I would hear paranormal sounds and then turn a corner and some guy would come out of nowhere scaring the hell out of me. That was just trying to get warm in the corner of the ship. And I'm like, oh my God, die of a heart attack. I mean, I was really blown away with Helen Mirren, and just what a professional was in how she conducted herself, and also how her performance went with Winchester. I thought she had done a really, really great job. Every movie is, with tons and tons of challenges, as going through filmmaking, and especially when, you're going through COVID and just fighting to try to make a movie. It's almost like entering a war in a way of who's going to survive at the end of this. And, I really don't have a favorite one way or another. As a producer, I'm just kind of one of those people that looks and sees all the imperfections and kind of go, oh my God, we could have done this better, but this is what went wrong, and I think that's the hard part with, with the audiences. They don't really know all the tales of horror that went on to make a movie at times, especially in the last 3 years, where, we were laughing the other day about how, there were days that we went without grips on the film, or without lighting technicians, or at times where Netflix would poach some of our department heads in the middle of the movie to go and work for them, and we'd be down a department head. It's just like these things that you don't hope to see on screen, so for me, I think everyone in a way is kind of a favorite because we got it in the can, and and quite frankly, we tried to tell the best story we could given what we were given in such a limited time frame. So I think everything is really kind of accomplishment, but I'm a perfectionist, so I always see the flaws, so. The location came to us. We worked with a great individual at the Queen Mary at the time named Steve Sheldon, who was responsible for all the entertainment events at the Queen Mary. He was the director at that time. And I pursued wanting to basically acquire the rights to film on the ship and use the trademarks and the stories. And sure enough, after years, probably 4 years of working with the city of Long Beach, we finally reached an agreement to do a movie. So it was a very, very long legal process, and then process began of writing the script. And that's always a challenge in itself. And then you take the next step of finding the director, and then the director wants to change everything usually, so it's always a fun creative process, but that's really how it went. So this has been almost a decade in the making. So, and nothing is ever easy in filmmaking, so it's to be expected. I thought it was just me at a time that, oh my God, only my movies take 10 years. But after listening to Steven Spielberg talk about how long it took him to make a film about one of the greatest presidents, in the United States history, with Abraham Lincoln, with Liam Neeson, who was attached to that role before he bowed out because of Taken's success, and he goes, it took him over 10 years to make that movie, and just goes to show you, how hard filmmaking is to get something made. Yeah, we were able to work with Steve Sheldon at the Queen Mary, who had a ton of knowledge about all the different myths and legends, because he was responsible for Dark Harbor. That is a famous event at the Queen Mary, and all the legends from Jackie to Lady in White. And then we worked with one of the Commodores, Everett Horde, who has been there for many years, and then John Thomas, who's the historian. And we tried to come up with a story that, in a way, told all the different, myths and legends of the Queen Mary, like I just mentioned. The little girl with the footprints, the idea of the Lady in White. I think one of the ones that really fascinated me and really was the cause and main central character of the film was the myth around the pool being a portal to the other side, was what everyone really talks about. And I thought, well, hey, if we could take that aspect and channel into something bigger, which was the item that fascinated me with getting the rights, was the Titanic really wasn't the unsinkable ship that everyone said it was with the White Star Line. It actually was the Queen Mary, the sister ship. Because if you look at through the whole term of her sailing the ocean, you saw everything from Hitler putting out a reward for sinking the ship. You saw a rogue tidal wave that basically hit the ship on its side and capsized it. And that was the whole story of the Poseidon adventure that came about. Of course, the Queen Mary was able to come back up. You have everything from the Curacao accident, where the Queen Mary hit the Curacao in the middle of the ship, and that could have sunk it. And then you look recently to all the bankruptcies that the Queen Mary has basically survived, where it could have become scrap metal. It really was the unsinkable ship at the end of the day. So even now, when you see the fight the city of Long Beach has had with trying to restore it and not give up on it. So I thought that was fascinating and was worth telling. Yeah, it's really fascinating. Even like what a lot of people don't realize is that the Queen Mary was, the next ship in line. And during the Great Depression, when it was being built, everything stopped. So they did not continue building the Queen Mary. And those shipyard towns, at that Great Depression time were, they were starving. This was what kept the town alive. And it really was the British government who came to Cunard and came to White Star Line and said, listen, we don't want you guys competing against each other. We want you guys to merge together to become Cunard White Star. And that's exactly what happened. And that's why the English government agreed to finish the financing on the Queen Mary, is because those two companies merged. So that was very fascinating. And I also thought that could play a role in the mythos of the Queen Mary as, okay, what happened, with the ship and its building, which we got into something very, very clever, which was, I'm not sure you're familiar with this, foundational sacrifices that go all the way back to the time of the Egyptians. And it was, plays a really tremendous part in the Queen Mary and explains why the pool is the portal and why the ship is actually unsinkable. So that was kind of our fiction that then lays into, whether you want to believe fiction or fact, to the idea of Lady in White and Jackie and having these all interplay as we go through our 1938 timeline. Yeah, I mean, we tried to incorporate as much as we could, that made sense. It didn't take people too off track, but it was very much, you're trying to get the idea of, whether you want to call her Jackie with the white footprints being seen all throughout the ship, whether or not you wanted to go and encompass Fedora Man, which is a great myth, on the ship. And then also talking about some of the military members that were from various German vessels that were prisoner of war that would come over, from the transatlantic crossings of the Queen Mary and relive the Curacao sinking. So all of that plays into a very, very cool storyline where all these concepts are married together into our timeline. So, as much as we can, even what happens in whatever you want to call it, the notorious stateroom where a murder was supposedly taking place, so we try to get as many stories and little winks and Easter eggs to Queen Mary fans as much as we can. I mean, realistically, it took us about, 18 months. It was a very, very long process because there was a lot of started stops, not only because of COVID, but then going and having to get COVID insurance and going through new COVID protocols to make sure all the cast and crew were safe. Then you're filming it in 2 different countries, the US and the UK. And then, as you know, with Queen Mary, the ship was vacant for now almost 2 years. So there were safety concerns there. There were issues with the actors being able to come over here with a travel visa with COVID with various countries. So whether it be the UK or Ireland, then you even had production issues over in the UK of whether or not, you had gas to get crew to the actual filming locations because the UK would run out of gas at times. Then you would have issues where, we have water scenes, but you couldn't heat the water or put child actors in it, and then, then you run into problems also where you're thinking you have 350 visual effects shots and the director has changed it to 700 or 800. So, he's trying to make it the most authentic movie that you can see and trying to elevate the quality of the film he's trying to produce. So a lot of hiccups along the way, but we're happy that it's done and the quality is definitely there, where I think you're going to have a very hard time telling what was filmed on the ship and what was filmed in the UK. You know what? We wanted to pick a very, very strong female lead because she's kind of the driver of our film, so I know our director was a big fan of Alice Eve, who has always had some great success at being the leading lady, whether it's for Star Trek or even the Downtown Abbey spinoff that she was just recently in. She always comes across as really commanding presence. And then we were lucky enough to work with Joel Fry, who just came off of Cruella, and that success with Emma Stone. And, he's just a fantastic actor and played really, really well with Alice. And then we found some great diamonds in the rough with Lenny Rush, who just won a BAFTA, and Will Coben, who is in Boys in the Boat for George Clooney, that's coming out. Just some real, talented actors. And we even were very fortunate to work with a gentleman that we found and discovered actually at Disney, named Wesley Alphen. And he is actually the first person that I just learned the other day to actually portray Fred Astaire in a TV or movie. And just watching him act and then plan the choreography and dance the role in the grand ballroom of the Queen Mary, it really kind of feels and took you back that you were actually in the ballroom in 1938 watching this happen as a guest, just having dinner. So it's nice to kind of watch these actors transport you, because Gary's wish in this casting was to find a really talented group, that could intertwine the two family stories, the ones in 1938 and the cast in 2023, and interweave them in a way that it felt very much like The Shining on a ship. You know what? I have to give it to Gary, that Gary told me, he goes, listen, I'm not trying to knock anybody's work, but he goes, I'm not trying to tell a Conjuring type story where we're trying to count the jump scares, through the film, where every studio executive that's in a horror, I guess, buying position for their studio, they all, hey, it's not a horror film if we don't have 35 jump scares, and Gary's attitude was, well, then we would never have gotten such great classics as The Shining, in some of these films in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. He goes, I'm more concerned of having a creepy vibe all the way through. And it's okay if the film is somewhat confusing. He goes, The Shining was confusing. Not everybody got it. He goes, it was just unbelievable performances, and the imagery was stunning, and it left people walking away not knowing all the answers and wanting to go and see it a second, a third time. So I think Gary really accomplished that, in making a film look like we had a much bigger studio $100 million budget than we did. So yeah, it's really a shame nowadays, because I run into so many studio heads, and you see things like Midsummer, and Midsummer didn't have a lot of jump scares. Didn't make it any less of a scary film. I mean, even Barbarian, if you really look at Barbarian, it had 4 or 5 good scares, but it wasn't the typical New Line cinema, let's do 40 jump scares or it's not a horror film, so I really wish that studios would look at horror films a little bit differently nowadays, try to get an array of horror than just going for the obvious. That's what we kind of experienced a little bit with Winchester, because Winchester skewed a little bit older in demographic, where you were getting late 20s and 30s to go see it, because Helen Mirren was in it, but also it didn't, get you having it didn't require you having a heart attack every 2 seconds, where there just was no pacing. It was really just a scare count. Listen, we try to go, I'm a big practical guy. So if I can go practical over special effects, I usually will, because listen, I every time I do interviews, I try to shoot everybody straight. We're not a James Cameron $500 million movie, so you're in the horror space, you have a limited budget, so you got to exercise what you can on it. So for us, our special effects were making the Queen Mary look like it was at sea. So when you see the opening shot and it's at sea, it looks, beautiful. It looks realistic. And that's where we really spent our money, is the set extensions and the ship at sea, because if we couldn't go and sell the 1938 with the ship still in operation, we weren't going to be able to sell you this story. But we did try to do as many, stunts, where Alice at one point is holding off of a door frame for one of the, as you probably saw in the trailer, where she's suspended above ocean, and we built the door frame and put the green screen under her and did that all practical, so we tried to do as much practical as we could. And even really the visual effects that we did do that were really mind-boggling, where we actually went to a visual effects stage, the same one that was used for The Mandalorian, where we had a virtual production where we were able to scan sections of the Queen Mary that we were a little bit concerned that if we were to film in those sections, we would damage the ship, and we didn't want to do that to us vessel. So we would actually film with a very small crew of 6 to 8 in the actual ship, let's say the grand ballroom, where we had fireworks going off and everything else, and we would scan that section and then rebuild it as a 360 virtual set, and then lay the actual floor and the tables in the center. And the camera, when it tracked, obviously the positioning of the background would move with the camera. So it kept you in that same perspective, and it's amazing what technology can do. So if there's anything that should be commended, was probably the virtual production aspect of it, that we had while working in the UK. So that's what we try to do, is be as authentic as we could, because the last thing we want to do is offer any kind of disservice to the Queen Mary fans, that are going to go and love this film and probably make it a cult hit through the years. I'm hoping with I guess the strike and everything else, there's not going to be a lot of content out. So hopefully people experience it and hopefully like it. So yes, it'll be August 18th, which is Friday of next week. And it will be available at certain theaters. I don't know which ones yet, but it will have a domestic release. I know it's going to be released in every country internationally in theaters. And then it'll also be domestically on VOD on Apple, Amazon, etc., starting on that same date, August 18th.